Reflections from Torch Trust, focusing on Christian faith and sight loss.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Reflections from Torch Trust. I'm Marilyn Baker, and this is the show that focuses on faith and disability in today's world. Well, on today's show, we're wishing a very popular British television show a happy birthday. Yes, it's time to say happy birthday songs of praise. The show launched on October the 1st, 1961, and has been running strong ever since. To celebrate its anniversary, we're sharing an interview recorded by Matthew Horsepool, a friend and former staff member of Torch. Matthew is blind and sings in Coventry Cathedral Choir. A couple of years ago, Matthew sat down with Paul Leddington-Wright, the choir's then conductor, to talk about Paul's work with the famous BBC show.
So Paul Leddington-Wright has been the principal conductor on the Songs of Praise programme on the BBC for a long time now, and I'm pleased to have him on the programme. Thanks, Paul, for coming along. Your history of Songs of Praise, I suppose, goes back to your history with music in general, and I know that you were Director of Music at Coventry Cathedral in the past, and I've worked with you in Coventry Cathedral Chorus and one or two other things. Maybe we should start by getting a bit of a history of your musical background. How did all of that start?
I mean, I left university back in the early 70s, and not knowing quite what to do. And ended up doing a bit of freelancing, and it was one of those things where the phone rings. An old friend of mine from university who I worked with on Footlights, he was involved in two shows, the Rocky Horror Show in London, and he was doing a Christmas show at the Haymarket Theatre, Leicester, but he couldn't manage them both, so he asked me if I'd take over the Leicester show. And so actually I started working in the professional theatre. And then one thing just followed on to another, and I just was an MD in the professional theatre, doing shows, pantos, musicals, what have you. In addition to that, of course, I had my love for church music, and I ended up taking a church job in Gerrard's Cross, and I was the organist there. So I was travelling around the country and working wherever I was doing theatre work, and then on Sunday back to Gerrard's Cross for Sunday services, which both happened in the morning, and then I was playing the organ at Windsor Methodist Church on the Sunday evening, and then back to Theatre World on the Monday. And whilst I was at Gerrard's Cross, there was a Songs of Praise that was recorded in a church in Chalfont St Peter for that area, and I ended up conducting that. So that was an interesting experience. But in 1977, Sheila and I got married. And I thought, well, I can't carry on working in the theatre. I need to think about something where I can sort of settle down a bit. And interestingly enough, I'd seen an advert in the Methodist Recorder for a director of music at the Coventry Methodist Central Hall. And I rang up the minister and he said, well, yeah, we'd love to have you, but we only pay £400 a year. You'd need at least another 2 jobs. So cut a long story short, I ended up doing the job of assistant organist at the cathedral, teaching 3 days a week at King Henry VIII School, and director of music at the Methodist Central Hall. And so I did that for 4 years. And then we left and went down to London. We lived in St Albans for 2 years. And then in 1984, cut a long story short, I ended up going back to Coventry Cathedral as I was appointed organist and director of music. And a couple of years after that, we had a phone call from Pebble Mill, where the BBC were in Birmingham. And they had a religious department, which was manned by one producer and a PA. And he came over to talk to Coventry Cathedral about possibly broadcasting a choral evensong. And we met and we got chatting. And he said, why don't we do Songs of Praise as well? And he said, well, I'd like to do it in the ruins, because I'd like to do a live satellite link with the Kreuzkirche in Dresden, which is Coventry's twin town. So Roger Hutchins was a very ambitious and exciting person to work with, because he had great ideas. And we had a live link between the two. and either Dresden led and we joined in, or we led and they joined in. We had exact number of beats between each verse and the introduction so that we could all keep together, even though, you know, we couldn't see. We only had an oral link one way or the other. And then shortly after that, I had a call from Roger Hutchins, the producer, who said, well, he said, you know, I'm very keen to actually improve the standard of Songs of Praise, because for years now we've just been using local people, and he said I want it on a much more professional level, so I'm thinking of setting up some programs, and would you be interested in coming and conducting? So I said, yeah, delighted to. So I ended up doing a program, conducting a program from Birmingham Town Hall, then also one in the shopping centre with a band in Birmingham in the Palisades. And that was great fun. And then in various other venues around the country that Roger was setting up. And then shortly after that, he was promoted to series editor. And then he brought Robert Prizeman on board. Bob has written the signature tune for Songs of Praise that we all know and love. And it just sort of snowballed from there.
Let's go back to our Songs of Praise special now, as Paul Leddington-Wright tells us his favourite part of working on the show.
I mean, working for Songs of Praise was wonderful. What I particularly loved and enjoyed was the rehearsals, when we would have people come together to make up the choir that would lead the singing for the recording. In the old days, it used to be 2 rehearsals, but then it cut down to 1. And so you'd get people singing soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and some school choirs would come in, never knowing how many from each part, and you'd rehearse them in the hymns and just get the standard as enthusiastic and high and well projected and faces up now to the books. And that's what the rehearsal was really for. Of course, we were chasing notes as well, and sometimes learning descants and this sort of thing. A number of years ago, there used to be a camera rehearsal, which is when everyone, including the congregation, that's the rest of the people that wanted to come to the recording, would fill the church or the cathedral. We'd have any instruments that we were having there, and we would go through everything 2 or 3 times as a camera rehearsal. And then the following night, we would come back and actually record all the various items. But as time went by and budgets got tightened, the camera rehearsal got lost. And so we'd have the choir rehearsal, and then we'd all come in and be thrown in to recording. But then there was usually 2 days of recording, because what happened then was they thought, well, we've got all the cameras and lights rigged up in the cathedral, the church, we may as well make the most of this. So we would record another program the following night. So it would always make at least 2 programs when we went to any particular venue. And then I remember for the 40th anniversary, that's right, the then head of Songs of Praise, by this time it had moved to Manchester, he decided that he wanted a special event that would be at the Royal Albert Hall for the 40th anniversary. And he said, we will get choirs from all around to make a massive choir, and then invite people to get tickets and come along as congregation, and we'll have the BBC concert orchestra. So we did that, and they asked me to conduct it, and so I went around rehearsing choirs everywhere, and we made a massive choir of 200 or 300 voices, and we had the BBC concert orchestra, and it was a huge success. The Royal Albert Hall was packed. And so he decided that he wanted to do this every year. So they decided that they would call it the Big Sing. And it worked very well. And so the Big Sing then continued for another sort of 12, 13 years. But I loved doing the Big Sings. So that was always a wonderful, fun thing to do. But at the heart of this was bringing people together to make music and to sing these wonderful hymns, to provide, I think, what would have been classed as worship for so many people, and still does to this day. People who perhaps can't get out to go to church themselves, but really appreciate having something on television that they can sit down and enjoy and be a part of. So getting the performance standard to the highest possible level was a great challenge, and that's what I enjoyed. And you knew that people really responded well. They loved the television aspect of it, but also giving the opportunity to sing some wonderful hymns And as I said, at a very good standard. Sometimes, we do an outside show with a brass band. That was very different, but also great fun. And back in the days of Roger Hutchins, when it was done from London, and I'm going back now to the sort of early 90s, they started a sort of series called Summer Sunshine. And what happened was, in February, we would go to somewhere else when everything was so gloomy and dark and grey and cold and wet in the UK. We'd go somewhere where there was some sunshine and record a programme. And I remember the first place we went to was Benidorm. We had a rehearsal in one of the hotels. And of course, there are lots of people who go out there, mainly retired people, for some summer sunshine. And of course, the expats that are there. And we got them all together, had a rehearsal. And then a few days later, we'd go down to the beach and we'd have a band, or even in Benidorm, actually, it was Bob Prizeman playing an electric organ on the beach, which got a bit worrying when the tide started to come in and was slapping around the bottom of this electric organ. And we'd record songs of praise on the beach in Benidorm. So there's been some wonderful times over the years with songs of praise.
We'll be hearing more from Matthew and Paul later in the show. But now it's time for our thought for the week. This piece was written by Stephen Richards, a visually impaired friend of the show, and this week he's considering what it means to be the genuine article.
Leonardo da Vinci's painting entitled Jesus, Saviour of the World sold at auction in New York for £341 million. 60 years ago, the same item sold in London for a mere £45. Back then, the painting was judged by experts to be a mere copy. When Jesus walked the earth 2,000 years ago, the religious and legal experts heard what Jesus said and saw what he did. However, they reckoned him to be a pretender. Yes, they were waiting for the coming of a saviour, or Messiah, for their nation. But Jesus simply was not ticking what they considered to be the right boxes. Over the period of a few decades, the experts have come to recognise the genuineness of Leonardo's painting, Jesus, Saviour of the World. They've given it their validation so that it has become the most costly painting ever sold. Question: has the Jesus of 2,000 years ago ever been similarly validated? Or were the experts of the day correct in saying that he wasn't the genuine article? The validation that Jesus was indeed the promised Saviour, Messiah, comes from God himself. After Jesus had been put to death as a blasphemer and fraud, God raised him to life 3 days later. He'd never done that before, nor has he done it since. God would not have performed such a feat for someone who wasn't the real deal. Every year at Christmas time, Christians celebrate the arrival of Jesus, the Saviour of the world. The Jews were expecting someone to come and save their nation. But God has a bigger agenda. It is one that encompasses not just people of a single nation, but people from all nations. Hence, Jesus is known as Saviour of the world. He has come to save men and women from living lives where God simply isn't in their picture. He tells us not to settle for some image of God that has no more life than paint on a canvas. Instead, we are told to acquire the genuine and most costly article, which is Jesus himself. And for this, we don't need money. We can receive him as our Saviour, in the way described by the traditional carol in the bleak midwinter. What can I give, poor as I am? What I can, I give him. Give my heart.
And you're listening to Reflections from Torch Trust. Today we're chatting with Paul Leddington-Wright in celebration of the 62nd anniversary of TV Songs of Praise.
I'm aware that you've also done lots of live work for the BBC, the daily service up in Manchester, and probably some Sunday worship programmes, and a midnight mass from Coventry, and some evensongs and all of that sort of thing. The difference between a recorded programme and a live programme is really quite something, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I like the buzz of doing live. I mean, it has an adrenaline-driven electricity about it, and it can really make it something quite special. And I loved doing the radio at a time when they were doing sort of live Radio 4 daily service, as you said. And I was going up once a month and doing 2 days, a Tuesday and a Wednesday, or Wednesday and Thursday, and loved that. That was great, working with a small team of professional singers. And we did, as you said, lots of Sunday morning worships and some live songs of praise. And I remember there was one that we did from the cathedral, actually, and they were recording some bits of it in the Chapel of Unity. And I remember it was live, and I was right at the front, in front of the chancel step with the congregation and whatever we had. And the floor manager was the person running around telling everyone when to start and throwing his arm down like they do and putting the arms out, stop, and that sort of thing. But it was live, so in a live show, the floor manager is even more critical because he knows what's going on all the way through. The director's talking to him all the time. And for some reason, for that one, I didn't have an earpiece, so I couldn't hear what's going on. Relied totally on the floor manager. And at one stage, he disappeared down the far end of the cathedral and was in the Chapel of Unity and was doing a link or something before the next piece of music. And I couldn't see him. I didn't know what was going on. And I just had to guess when the next particular piece of music started. And because it's live, you don't get a second chance. So that was becoming a little bit nerve-wracking. I think we got it all right. But you can never tell what's going to happen when you're doing a live. Sometimes things don't quite go according to plan.
No, and things go slower and faster and things like this. It amazed me that I've done a few live services up at Didsbury, and it absolutely amazed me that every service we managed to finish a few seconds before 10 o'clock, and we never ran over and we never ran under, and just the amazing level of production and the attention to detail that must go into making sure that all of that happens.
Absolutely, and that's why the rehearsal is critical. And then after the rehearsal, going through, checking the timings, and when a producer will say we need to lose this verse or lose that verse or the rest of it. And I remember one daily service in the early days of doing it, because it relies on the conductor, of course, to make sure that the music is at the same speed when you come to do the broadcast, because if you timed it at one speed and then you do it at a different speed in the broadcast, it throws everything out. And on this particular occasion, I can't remember what happened, but I remember the producer suddenly coming in during the last hymn, right at the beginning of the first verse, and he stood in the corner and he was winding up this wheel saying, quicker, 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 quicker. He was desperately running out of time, and occasionally I'd get a message to say, cut out a verse, and I'd have to sort of try and indicate that to the choir that we were going to lose a verse that we hadn't planned on losing because something had gone wrong with the timings. And so during this particular hymn, I was gradually having to sort of, without it sounding too obvious, actually speed up as we went through to try and get through it all in time. But on the whole, as you say, it does work extremely smoothly, and all falls into place without any undue trouble.
Well, I'm sorry to say we're all out of time for today. I hope you've enjoyed our show, and if you'd like to find out about any of Torch's offerings for blind and partially sighted people, including our accessible lending library or network of fellowship groups, then please do get in touch. The number is 01858 438 260. That's 01858 438 260. Or you can email info@torchtrust.org. So from me, Marilyn, and everyone on the Reflections team, goodbye and God bless.
You've been listening to Reflections from Torch Trust.